I consider myself an educator first and involved in technology as an enabling device, not as a solution to replace teachers or anything else. I do come from a family of teachers, and my mother's advice when I first got started was help out educators and then get the heck out of their way. So I think that is definitely really, really good advice. I see Rebecca's nodding head and Federico's smile, so I think that resonates on some level. What I'd love to do today is I'd love to talk about the concept of participatory budgeting through a slightly different lens. I want to talk about it in terms of numbers and emotional health. Part of the reason I want to do that is because as I think about how this has found a place in my own life, I think putting a lens on where I've come from, what I have done, and what I've tried to bring into the classroom might also take participatory budgeting and take it through a slightly bigger picture to highlight just how many different places it can have an impact when we get young folks comfortable with numbers. The more that they've got an understanding of how these intersect with their lives, whether it's their future financial success or even the challenges that they might be facing in their next steps, I think the better we are all prepared for the successes and failures that inevitably are going to be coming next. So I'm going to share my screen and present a bit. Let's see. Oops, that's not present. Can everybody see my screen? Does it say more than numbers failure? Okay, I've got the thumbs up from Rebecca. Rebecca, you are so engaged. I love the fact that you're offering this feedback so quickly. This is excellent. So what's my story? I grew up very lucky. There are a whole bunch of genetic and demographic reasons that I can count myself lucky. I grew up in and around New York City, and when I was a young child, I had a father that was very successful financially. His professional career led him into banking. We had all of the creature comforts that one could imagine growing up. I grew up surrounded by professional athletes. I grew up surrounded by a whole bunch of things that as a young boy, I couldn't have asked for more. And when I was 16 years old, my dad bought a minor league basketball team in the CBA. That was the minor league to the National Basketball Association for quite some time. And I moved to a new town, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I caught an accent or two before, so we might be spanning the globe. The shaking of your head, no, and I'm going to keep going with Rebecca on this one. Oh, Rebecca Burrow actually had heard of Harrisburg. I saw a raised hand. I saw Luke's got a thumbs up in there. Harrisburg is generally not on the top of most people's bucket list. It doesn't go New York, London, Paris, Harrisburg. So to move from New York to central Pennsylvania was definitely a bit of a change for me. But I got to be the owner's son in a new town. I got to hang out with the players. I got to hang out with the cheerleaders. I got to go down to the court, give away tickets, give away t-shirts. That was pretty amazing. However, within 6 months, the team went bankrupt. And all of a sudden, I was facing a very different financial situation. As we were kind of coming to terms with what bankruptcy meant for the family and what it meant to plan out my future, I'll tell you that a lot of folks said, you know what, focus on the things in front of you that you might be able to control. We often hear these elements like, you know, your future's in front of you. You can apply to college and open all sorts of new doors. And I appreciate that. And in facing challenges, I think going in with an idea of what the numbers look like, what the probabilities look like, how you fit in with the larger world is pretty important. One of the things that I took away from my early conversations with Luke and participatory budgeting is that in some microcosmic way, the intersection of the young folks over this conversation is about widening their own view of the world. It's no longer just about their classroom or their home or their after-school activities. It's now taking a look at how they fit in the much larger ocean, not just the small pond they've been playing with. For me, I have loved numbers from the earliest age, and for me, they brought me a lot of comfort. But when it came time to apply to college, not so much. There are a whole range of different emotional issues that we face. I don't think that I appreciated these numbers when I was growing up, but nonetheless, these were all around me. This is where we sit right now. 1 in 3 teens are most likely going to meet the criteria for anxiety, depression clinically. 7 out of 10 teens experience struggles with mental health in the past year. We've got increased isolation and disconnection. No one to turn to. 82% of teens want to talk more honestly about mental health and openly, but nearly 50% said they're now more likely to turn to YouTube for advice instead of a parent. Now, by the way, I don't think that is just a today phenomenon. Mark Twain has a great quote saying, "I left home at 18 thinking my parents were the stupidest people I'd ever met. Returned home in 7 years, surprised at how much they learned." So let's be honest, we don't often turn to our parents. But if we're not able to turn to our groups, to our peers, to those around us to find support, to find connection, well, we're probably missing out. One of the greatest advantages of participatory budgeting is that first word. It's participatory. It's about bringing folks together because it takes a village. It's better together. Fill in the blank with how our humanity makes us social. That's what we're really talking about. Who do we turn to? Those people around us. In my case, I struggled a lot with that because in my school, there weren't many guidance counselors. Nationwide in the United States, 482 students to one counselor. That's just not enough. If you're talking to your teachers in school, 71% of teachers in the United States say they don't have enough time to talk about social emotional learning in the classroom. And 82% of them say they're not even trained to do so. But oftentimes we look outside of ourselves and we don't always go looking in the right place. There's a great episode of I Love Lucy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the TV show or if all of you are. I, again, keep looking to Rebecca. Your smile lights up my screen. There's an episode where Lucy is on the floor in our living room looking for something. And Ricky comes home and says, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I lost my earrings." And he said, "Oh yeah, out here in the living room?" And she says, "No, in the bedroom. But the light is better out here." That is one of the biggest problems we face. We are looking for other places to come up with these solutions, and we're often not looking in the right place. If what we really did was looked around our peer group for more of the support, as opposed to just thinking that our social emotional development needs to just come from a psychiatrist or needs to come from this one other expert, as opposed to finding the support that we need in the group, I think we would find ourselves in a stronger place. If we didn't think we had to go it alone, I think we'd find ourselves in stronger places. But often when we're young, we're really, really intimidated by the idea that we're going to fail because we often don't know exactly how we intersect with everybody else. Well, when it came time to apply to university for me, the numbers that I was confronted with were pretty scary. There are 30,000 high schools in the United States, which means there are 30,000 valedictorians, incredibly successful, high-performing students. There are 30,000 presidents of student government. There are 30,000 editors-in-chief of school newspapers. There are 300,000 captains of varsity sports teams, and just about everybody has an amazing GPA. Now, if I took a look around at the Ivy League and said, what are my chances of getting into a really, really challenging school, I might find myself saying, you know what, I don't know where I sit in relation to everybody else, but I see these numbers here and I'm really, really scared. I'm not sure if I can do this alone. What do I do? Well, for me, I was incredibly lucky. FirstRoot didn't yet exist, so there was no participatory budgeting for me to engage with. How do we come together as a group? But in each of the groups that I was involved in, whether that was student government or the school newspaper or Math Olympiad, I found incredible support from my peers, from those people that pushed me. And so what did I do? I applied to a whole bunch of universities. I'm sad to say I was rejected from Stanford. Stanford is a stupid school and no one should ever go there. I got rejected from Princeton. No one should ever go there either. But I did get a full scholarship to Harvard, and you know what? It kind of turned out okay. But again, I was only able to do that because I was surrounded by a whole bunch of other young people who encouraged me. And that to me was a real differentiator. I think often when we think of social emotional health, we think of it as something that's developed independently or just at home. It's not, and that's false. While I had really, really supportive parents, I struggled to find the social emotional health that I was looking for at home, and I found it in groups. And those are the folks that encouraged me to continue to push myself. Often we take a look at groups, and sometimes those groups are also overwhelmed by the numbers that they face. I would like to point this out to my aspiring athletes. If you're thinking to yourself that you might find success, but you're facing daunting numbers, you might be one of those basketball players who says, I'm going to be successful in the NBA. Well, you have a better chance of getting 4 of a kind in the first round of draw poker. That 3 in 10,000 chance, not all that likely. If you're a young lady and you're wondering about playing professional basketball, same chance that the killer asteroid will destroy civilization in the next century. You want to be drafted by an NFL team, about 9 in 10,000, roughly the chance you have an IQ above 150. For those of you on this call, I'm going to hazard a guess. If you're educators, you're probably pretty high performing already. Average IQ of PhD students, 130. But again, these are numbers that can intimidate us. But are we really telling our athletes and other folks that numbers are scary? I hope not. Otherwise, no one is ever going to pick up a baseball bat. No one is ever going to pick up a ball. No one is ever going to apply to those other schools. But when we find ourselves in the group, there is tremendous power. Success is about more than numbers. And when I think about going beyond the numbers, I think about all of these elements that we refer to as non-cognitive skills in the education space. Social emotional health is really delivered, grown, cultivated by taking a look beyond the numbers alone. And when I think about the intersection here of something like self-control, that discipline that I can bring to stay focused on a topic, or the curiosity to go beyond what I've already known, or the conscientiousness to dive even deeper, the persistence to see it through, the grit to dust myself off when I'm struggling, and the self-confidence to believe that all of this is possible. Think about how each of these intersects with the concept of participatory budgeting. Self-control means that you don't get to just stand up there and say, I'm right. Whatever I said is the way that we should do this. That's not how things work. I'm going to be part of a group dynamic. And when I'm part of a group dynamic and I can recognize, accept, promote, and support other participation, the opinions, the viewpoints, the perspectives of others, I can find myself working better not only in the group, but cultivating the skills that will help me succeed, whether I'm playing professional baseball or applying to an elite school or doing none of those and finding some happiness in my own life. Curiosity. Well, if I'm going to have an idea, you know what? Let's be honest, I'm probably not the only one with an idea. Perhaps I might want to hear a little bit more about what Rebecca or Luke or Samuel or Jessica might have to say. Sitting in a group and allowing myself to participate and saying, since I'm not the monopoly holder of truth, maybe I need to dive into what somebody else is doing. These are the core elements of social emotional learning. And these are what are reflected in a group budgeting process. Conscientiousness, I can't just throw off information off the top of my head and assume that it's right. I'm going to have to dig in deeper. But this isn't a once and done sort of meeting. This requires persistence. This requires staying through a process. So much of what we wind up seeing in schools, and I don't say this lightly, I say this with some sense of tragedy and disappointment, is a rush to very small engagements. I have a test on a Friday. I stay up late studying on a Thursday. I regurgitate that information for a test. I forget it over the weekend and I repeat the process the following week. I study again for my A-levels if I'm in the UK at the end of the year, but I am cramming as much content into my brain as I possibly can. You know what group participatory budgeting does? It extends all of that. That project-based learning, that group discussion requires me to set a goal, plot some set of actions, continue to interact with that, and work towards a final objective. But I'm not going to do it just because I try hard. I'm going to have to face that element called grit. Can I put my head down, fail, and stand back up? Because I've got the self-confidence to recognize it's okay to get something wrong. Everything that I just said when I talked about beyond the numbers, just as easily applied to me applying to college, just as easily applied to me wanting to become a professional athlete or play a sport at a college level, just as easily applied to participatory budgeting. Often we live in silos when we look at schools. I overheard the end of the conversation before, the end of the conversation before about how disconnected some of these elements are. Where does financial literacy sit? Often it sits in whatever open place there might be to stick it in a master schedule. That doesn't feel integrated. That doesn't feel across all grade levels. That doesn't feel coherent. When I talk about social emotional learning, everything that I just said is just as applicable in an English class and a math class and a budgeting conversation as it is for any other of the great challenges in life. And as we get older, we look back and we probably think to ourselves, why didn't we learn more of this before? Why did I have a chemistry class to learn a bunch about balancing equations, but not learn what it means to sit in a group dynamic and have respect for others to work towards a common goal? This is really what needs to be front and center in schools. This, to me, is what led to my successes in life. And this is what's helped me overcome the many failures that I've experienced. Why? Because no one has a straight rocket ship path up. We are bound to run into a bunch of brick walls along the way. So, what does success look like for me in this big picture? Well, I tell my students it's about ambition first. If you don't wake up every day with some big picture dream, you are never going to succeed at anything. Let's put it back in this context. If I want to change my school, if I want to impact my community, I need to be able to find something that's a little bit bigger than just the, let's have another bake sale. I need to come up with something that feels that it's going to have impact and be important. For me, that was about starting a company. In another setting, it might be funding a club. It might be funding an after-school activity. But I couldn't do all of these things on my own. My ambition wasn't personal. My ambition was about a group, and it was about impact. I founded A-List in 2005. We had 5 students. It's not exactly a recipe for blockbuster success, but you have to start somewhere. My ambition was to grow something that would have a lasting impact as students moved from high school to college. That's what I set out to do. That ambition wasn't quite grounded in numbers. That ambition was grounded in impact. I didn't just say that I needed to make $1 million or that I needed to have 500 partners, but I did start with that objective. And that ambition is a great way for me to also think about how participatory budgeting really works. It's not just, how do I spend $1,000? It's how do I have impact? How do I create change? The participatory budgeting conversation is meaningfully different because the group comes together to set that. It's not just how do I spend $1,000, it's how do I create something that lasts or that matters. That conversation is about more than the number, and this gives us a lens through which we can have that conversation. That gets me really excited. But when I talk to my students about success and beginning with ambition, does it always work out? No. The second rule for me in success is failure. That is going to happen as well. When I think about when we started at A-List and we started with our handful of students, I thought all of a sudden I was going to be able to have all of these students knocking on my door and thousands of successes. But the truth is I needed to fail in the process. And that is another thing that is intrinsic to this conversation. It's not as though you sit down to have a participatory budgeting conversation and all of a sudden, everybody just arrives at the right answer at the beginning. That's not how life works. That's not how this sort of context works. It's certainly not how my experience in entrepreneurship has worked. For anybody on this call that's ever started a company, we all know failure is part of the deal. If you haven't stayed up late on a Thursday night wondering if, not if you're going to fail the test, but wondering if you're going to make payroll, you've never been an entrepreneur. If you've never walked into a sales meeting and gotten yourself really excited to win the contract only to find out that they say no and they went with your arch rival, then on some level, you've never really done that either. In my mind, as I look at these various pieces, there are going to be elements of this that are baked in as well. Why? Because somebody is going to have a pitch and think it's awesome, and little Johnny or little Luke or little Rebecca is going to say, absolutely not. That is the worst idea ever. We are not going to put a new bench in the front of the school. We are not going to build that statue. We are not going to pay for the trip to Great Adventure. Don't be afraid of it. If I were afraid of that failure, I would have never made that pitch. Part of the exact process of this back and forth, this interaction, this conversation, is that it is going to make more common and make more comfortable the idea that we're going to fail in the process. I came across a fantastic discussion by a professor at Harvard Business School, Professor Cantor. Her law basically says everything looks like a failure in the middle. But imagine yourself back in middle school, or imagine yourself back in high school, and imagine your perspective about how progress and growth works. I can tell you from my perspective, I thought the way that the grades work was the way that life worked. You move from 6 to 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 to 11 to 12 to college to marriage to houses to mortgage to retirement to golf. There was this clear, straight path. Well, probably not golf. I suck at golf, but whatever. Point being, there is a straightforward progression that moves from one thing to the next. In reality, that is not how life works, and everything is going to look like a failure in the middle. Well, if I've come up with a budget and I've come up with a plan, and I thought that things were just going to work, you know what I need to know? It's okay that I'm going to fail. And in this context, we are going to find out that failure is real, and that's okay. This is one of my favorite graphical portrayals of how things work when you institute some kind of change. Wherever you have been at that moment of change, you are going to have some chaos that is going to make it worse than it was before. You're going to have the hard conversation with your peers, the hard conversation with the facilitator, the hard conversation with the vendor who no longer can make the price work. But that's okay. In those changes, in those moments of change, is when we start to see the real growth. Pushing through that friction is what is going to get us to the new, better place. Taking comfort in the discomfort is inherent in project-based learning. That to me is something that we've got a unique opportunity using the idea of participatory budgeting as a microcosmic lens to teach these lessons is really important. Because how do I overcome failure? Commitment. We started off with an idea, we started off with a budget, we ran headlong into the fact that things cost 3 times as much. But what are we going to do? Throw up our hands and give up? No, we're going to find an alternative. We're going to persevere and we're going to evolve. It turns out we can't build the jungle gym anymore, but you know what? We can have 4 swings and a seesaw. That's the problem solving that we're afforded in this context. That's the chance for personal growth. How do I overcome failure? Keep failing, but don't give up. To me, again, all of this has been writ large in my life over time. What does it take to succeed? Ambition, failure, commitment. What is participatory budgeting? I have an ambition to institute change. Whatever I am going to try and do is going to run into some kind of hurdle. That is totally fine. But I'm going to see things through. And when I think about what it's going to take to succeed and I see that commitment, I can find myself on the other side. Where does that bring me? Well, I started A-List. A-List has grown over time, and I am extremely proud of it. At this point in time, we serve more than 100,000 young people around the world. We have offices in London and Geneva and Zurich and Dubai and Shanghai and across the United States. But so much of what's baked into A-List is a group dynamic. Long before I met Luke, I knew that what I really wanted to have was project-based learning in a bigger play, in a bigger setting, in more places. And so I took my learnings at A-List, and in 2017, I sat down with a mentor in my life. And I told her everything that I was up to. And she said, Scott, I'm going to have to interrupt you for a second. I'm going to need you to just shut up. Now, it was pretty painful to hear. But the truth is sitting down and putting that stuff on the table and trying to compare my ambition and my failures to where I wanted to go, she gave me a couple of really important rules that I've tried to incorporate in my life. She said, Scott, here's some lessons you need to learn, and you need to learn them right now. Number 1, bigger doesn't mean better. Number 2, more does not mean you're winning. Number 3, you are not nearly as successful as you think you are, or that you tell people that you are. Number 4, I don't think you're happy. And number 5, you look terrible. All of those things put together were really painful to hear. But you know what came out of that in my hindsight? The only way I could be better was to be doing something with somebody else. If we were both coming together for a goal of making my impact better, we got better results. And that's how Robin was born. By trying to do something on my own, I could only take it so far. By trying to bring it to somebody else who had their own vision, I could get further. Robin is a company focused on bringing social emotional learning into the classroom. Luke kicked it off and said that is my newest venture, and he is 100% right. I see Robin as a complete and total complement to so many things that are out there. So many powerful opportunities to be able to line up social emotional learning to finance, to English class, to science class. It doesn't really matter. But that social emotional learning is writ large what I focus on. And I've tried to bring that to other things that I do. Mental Health Partnership is working in the Midwest. We serve thousands of clients in a clinical setting. Dr. Richard Barnett Foundation, he's a former NBA Hall of Famer. We focus on underrepresented youth that are looking for careers in the field of sports. All of these come together to say we are better together. That to me is really where we can have our greatest impact. So I'm going to wrap up here with a thought. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn this into a more of an interactive back and forth. Great advice. The Chinese are full of fantastic proverbs, among many other great contributions to the world. This is one of my favorite. Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I'll remember. Involve me and I'll understand. I think that is some pretty great advice. I know that I have more time to present and I could take this in any direction, but having worked over the years with thousands of students and done tens of thousands of hours of classroom instruction, professional development, all sorts of other things, I'm only as good as the audience engagement. Otherwise, I'm talking to myself. So I'd like to pause for a moment. I'd like to open it up to the group. I'd love to hear a little bit of either reaction or thought to some of the things that I've shared so far. We can dive back into the concept of more than numbers. We can talk about some of the project-based learning that we have done in schools that is specific to the idea of that group dynamic. But I'd love to hear from all of you first before I prejudge how to make use of the rest of our time. I've also learned over the time in my space in education that talking for too long means that people stop listening. So it's also a great opportunity to just say, is anyone still there? Does anyone have any thoughts? So, people are coming on camera. It does mean they're listening, or at the very least, they were wondering, I hope he doesn't call on me. So with that, let me pause, open it up to any questions, comments, reactions, thoughts, and then we'll use this to pivot into wherever we go next. Not hearing any, I'm going, I feel like somebody just came off mute. Oh, it's my friend Rebecca, or my new friend Rebecca, who smiles and seems super engaged. Rebecca, go for it. What's on your mind?
Well, I was intrigued to hear about Robin and social emotional learning. You may not have seen my presentation, but that was part of the connect that we do in our financial literacy outreach, and the focus, particularly when we're presenting. There's a conference in California called the Multi-Tiered System of Support Conference, MTSS, and the whole arc around which that conference takes place is about the importance of social emotional learning. But it's a challenge when you look at those so-called soft skills. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about how Robin brings that into schools in a way that is tangible and has results.
Absolutely. And actually, I'll take that question in a slightly different direction first, but I'm going to come back to that. I would just like to anchor it in the idea that schools often know best. And I want to use that as kind of a first principle for a moment, because one size fits all is never going to work. And I'm sure, Rebecca, you've seen in your work that a slightly different thing that worked here might work better differently with a different school. And I want to kick it off with a bit of a story. I was trying to figure out at some point how to marry the concepts of lifelong earning to lifelong learning. And part of that was, if I sit back for a second and know intuitively, or because of how I was brought up, that going to college had a financial impact on my future. How was I going to work in A-List? We serve about 100,000 students, but 90% of our students don't pay a dollar for what we do. So I'm working in a lot of districts with Title I funding, varying levels of high school completion and college persistence. And I came across a story from a principal in Chicago. And the principal was battling the same question. How do I connect those two concepts? And she surveyed her students. And in surveying her students, what she found was something that I think as an adult would be counterintuitive, but makes perfect sense to a teenager. The number one reason that they weren't going to college was money, but not the affordability of college, the ability to earn today. If I couldn't go get a job tomorrow to help support my family or to help pay for my expenses or to put money into my pocket, college was a future payoff. That instant gratification space made it difficult for me to put one and one together and get two. So she gave that survey, she got that feedback, and she came up with a really novel idea. She went across the street and she made a deal with the local bank. And she took out $1 million in cash under armed guard and spread it around her office. And she marched the 9th grade class through her office. And she said, this is the difference in your earning power over your lifetime between a high school diploma and a college diploma. That was an incredibly powerful moment for me. Here it was that she was taking the finance piece and she was syncing it up with what her educational goals were, but she did it with a survey first. And that is one of the things that I think that I would use to start answering the question, Rebecca. When Robin got started, what we wanted to do was, everyone talks about social emotional learning, but what does that really mean in an individual set of schools? And how do we wind up making it relevant? So in order to avoid some of the clinical stigma of saying, here's the PHQ-9 and we're going to measure your depression, or here's the GAD-7 and we're going to see if you have risk factors for generalized anxiety disorder, we took a survey for anybody on the call that has a background in mental health. Draper and Lee are two psychologists that put together a really valuable instrument that measures connection. And so what we used as our foundational principle for social emotional health is connection. Dr. Ned Hollowell is a leading child psychiatrist, is one of our co-founders. He writes about what he calls vitamin C all of the time. And the connection survey has an element of feelings about money, feelings about body image, feelings about family, feelings about school. And it's how connected are you to positivity and to people in your life around all of those. And then we use that data to sync up programming that is directly related. So I'll give, yeah, Luke, 100%. Does connection supported at all ages? For those of you who've been following the Harvard longitudinal study, connection is what keeps you alive.
That's what I was wondering, because I thought it was like there's a couple of simple determinants of health. One of them being how many home cooked meals you eat and how many connections you have.
You couldn't be more on target. That connection piece is incredibly important, and we find that it improves mental cognition as you age. Your physical health is impacted just across the board. That connection matters. Now, if we take that connection and we root it in Rebecca's question, then what we want to do is not only see the connection across the board at a particular school, but what topic, theme could we connect our programming to that also feels really related to the community? So as an example, the Young Women's Leadership Schools is a charter network on the East Coast. They've got a number of New York campuses. And we found that about 40% of those students responding to the survey highlighted a real sense of negativity and negative association with body image. So what we did for our SEL programming is, rather than make this a, let's talk about all the things that exist around social emotional health, it's how do we couch this differently into something that feels very connected to your experience? And how do we bring in speakers that connect to your background, that connect to your struggles? And we take those big themes and make them more granular. But we also have to connect to a school in a way that doesn't replace what they're trying to do. So there's seldom a place in a school day for a full classroom. And I'll tie this back to FirstRoot for a second. Sometimes you might find a school that says, give me a financial literacy curriculum and I have a place to put it, but often you don't. So how do we connect to their school day? For them, what we did is we created a speaker series. So the speaker was speaking directly to these issues, and then 5-minute activities. That was it. We didn't have to try and crowd out more of the school day, but part of these were consuming asynchronous content or then generating students' own experiences. So for us, when we think about the introduction, and I can send you more about this and we can talk more about it offline, Rebecca, but when we find a school that says, our lack of connection stems from issues of finance, that's where FirstRoot fits in. When we find a school that says our lack of connection with family, that's where we start talking about other ways to find positive mentorship in a community. So to us, project-based learning could be finance, it could be body image, it could be any of these, but our social emotional health is cultivated by finding a connection to where you're coming from and then making that theme for us feel very much bite-sized and aligned to what your survey information is giving back to us. Is that helpful, or did I try and answer too many things in too many different ways?
No, I think it was a very rich answer.
Well, but I think it.
No,
and
I thank you for that.
And Rebecca, I want to make another link that I think I've talked to Scott. I think I've talked to you about this on one of our calls, but if I haven't, I'm remiss. But one of the things that remember, my background is helping really big companies do portfolio management on really big budgets because they spend most of the time fighting, and the annual budgeting process is awful. So, the kind of projects that I was given was, hey, Luke, we're flying every single country manager from around the world to Warsaw, Poland with the board of directors for Daimler Financial Services. And you have to reprioritize our 200 million euro budget. And you have one day, and the board of management is going to be in the room, and it has to be done by the end of the day. And it has to be agreement from every country manager. Okay, right? But one of the things that I talk about when I'm explaining it to adults is, and Scott may have heard this, and I think my team has, but Rebecca, I'll pretend that you're the one who has it. My wife and I are both runners, pretty good mileage runners, which mean we buy running shoes fairly frequently. For me, it's once a quarter because I do a lot of trail running, pretty heavy running. Now, if I go out and buy a new pair of running shoes, do you think Jenna cares? Not really. I mean, it's a relatively small. It's not that running shoes are cheap, but in the grand scheme of living in California with a mortgage and other kids and car payments and blah, it's a relatively cheap expense that is consistent with my normal behavior. Now, I do care about someone's opinion, but it's not Jenna's, it's the running shoe clerk, because they're going to show me if there's a new model that I should consider. Maybe there's a better model for my foot and my running gait. So I want technical information. And my statement is spending decisions, which is what are bombarding our kids, are promoting a lack of connection because they're based on the individual purchase. What do you want? You don't need to have anyone else's opinion, and it's your money. But I contend that any investment decision you make in your life is done in collaboration. You wouldn't buy, trust me, if I drove home with a new car and said, and we need a new car. I've got a minivan that has had 14 years with 4 kids. If I took a photo of it, you'd be shocked. I need a new minivan. I've had the mechanic put his hand on my shoulder and say, really, Luke, no more repairs. It's right. So, but if I drove home in a new minivan and said, hey, check out what I bought, I think Jenna's going to be upset, right? Because it's an expensive, infrequent, but it's an investment in a certain form of transportation. And that you wouldn't buy a vacation home without talking to a tax advisor. You wouldn't buy a primary home without talking to, the people who are affected. You wouldn't hire an employee without talking to references. Even if you're buying an index fund in the stock market, you're merely transferring the collaboration to the people who determine who is in and out of the Dow Jones average, because that's a choice that a set of people make about who is in and out of the Dow Jones or S&P. So the point that I think, Scott, now that you brought up the notion of connection, is that is really fundamental to how we perceive the importance of participatory budgeting and the training of, teaching kids how to plan a family vacation with their parents, how to have a conversation about charitable donations with their parents, how to have a conversation about home improvements and improvements to the school. So I really like this notion of connection, and I've got some notes, but I think that is, without realizing it, I think it's much more profound and more profoundly aligned to how we are teaching kids in our version of financial curriculum. Is like, look, you need to know these basics. What you really need to be able to do is talk about money in a way that promotes human relationships. Just like I tell business leaders, the reason we do participatory budgeting around millions of dollars of budget is because not every decision can be made by ROI. Even McKinsey has said this. McKinsey has said ROI-based decisions alone on portfolio budgeting is a horrible way to make decisions in business, precisely because it does not include the necessary relationship and connection component that business leaders must have inside their companies.
Well, and Luke, let me take that in another additional direction as well. When we started working with some schools on social emotional learning, and I think any of us that have spent time in the education space have run into these moments where, teachers and schools are wondering, is this really interesting to kids? Is this just like woo-woo nonsense? Like, is this something that they're really going to engage with? So as part of our programming, we run 30-day challenges. Inside of our 30-day challenge, students can consume daily activities, they can have a mindful minute, they can share a journal entry. The most popular part of our 30-day challenge is our wall of wins. And in our wall of wins, it's basically positive social media. So I made breakfast for my mom today and she smiled. She's getting high fives from all of her classmates. Mrs. Gallagher kept me after school to help me study, and I really understood the math. Teachers and students pouring on to support. I think if you had asked me 10, 15 years ago, if many educators would have really bought into the positivity that comes from these kinds of group endeavors, or that the connection in and of itself could be more valuable than the content, I think you would have had much greater pushback. One of my good friends and collaborators is the CEO of a company called Total Brain, a pretty fascinating company. We're going to be working with them in the education space, focusing on cognition and heart rate and stress and a bunch of other stuff. He's French. I don't speak French, so I can't say it in the original French, but apparently it's an aphorism in French that the world would do better with better formed brains than better filled brains. And I think that's a really important takeaway here, is that what we're seeing in FirstRoot or in Robin or in any of these programs is that it's not so much just the content, the behaviors that are endemic to that sort of platform or to that kind of interaction are their own lessons. And I think that's what we're really waking up to in the education space. And by the way, that's not just like yesterday. It's been a movement for the last several decades. But the rise of non-cognitive skills and being placed front and center in the educational context is a relatively recent phenomenon. I know that when I sit down and have this conversation with my mother, she is extremely excited. She was a high school art teacher for 30 years. And she said, I struggled for any subject besides reading, math, fill in the blank with the core subjects to penetrate, that proverbial armor around the principal's priority list. It just didn't make it. Now there's an openness. Students are asking for it. Parents want it. Teachers are open to it. It now seems like there's been a real sea change here, or at least we'll say a slight opening of the door. If not a sea change.
Well, well, the future is here. It's that quote about it being unevenly distributed, and you and I are the kind of people who distribute that future more evenly.
At least we try to, Luke. I don't know who's judging the grand book of our accomplishments or failures just yet. I'm hoping the ledger is tallying well.
Well, and I think that the positive social media angle is so critical. When we're working on our curriculum to teach children how to have that conversation about giving feedback that can be both critical and uplifting. And you and I both know this because, athletes get it, right? We're about, receiving feedback that can be pretty critical, but we know that the giver of that feedback, it has truly our best interests at heart, our coaches, and they're after high performance. I hope my team knows, and I think they do, I can give some pretty rugged feedback on our product reviews, but they also are grounded in how much I care about them as people and how much I believe in them as people. And so I think that is something that is not just for the teachers, it's something for the students themselves to learn how to work with each other on that kind of feedback.
I'd like to pick up on that for a second too.
Oh, please.
The communication piece around the feedback is one that it takes time to develop a comfort in hearing that feedback. And if the first time that you wind up getting that negative feedback is when you're a college freshman and you get your first C after you've been given A's your entire life, that's crushing. It's not even easy to process. But the idea that there's a space for that communication to be both positive and constructive is really special. And that communication can be one where we learn to communicate better and more frequently is something that is going to have a positive impact. My wife and I, we've been married 16 years. It is just this year that we have learned to start off with conversations by saying, what type of conversation would you like this to be? Would you like to just listen? Would you like to try and offer advice? Where do we go from here? And that's something that took us a while to do. Now imagine you're 12 years old and you have your first great idea and somebody tells you it's terrible. That could be crushing, or it could be the most eye-opening experience of your life because your great idea actually wasn't quite as great as you thought it was, but your peers were willing to hear you out and make your idea better. That's a lesson you'll take with you that can't be replicated somewhere else. That takes a particular type of project-based learning sort of scenario where that engagement and communication is featured very highly. I love diving down the rabbit hole of connection. Rebecca, you might be on mute. Sorry, if you were going to pop back in. Oh, no. Okay. Did anybody else want to pop in with any responses, questions, or to take the conversation in a different direction?
I just want to say I really enjoyed and find really interesting the entire presentation and the way you communicate everything around the well-being and the social health. And I do agree that we are currently living in hard times with the COVID and pandemic, etc. So my question could be like, what could be the difference in the connection between people during these times, and how do you were you able to manage and thrive with the current state of the world?
Federico, it is such a fantastic question. And I'll tell you that I just came across a study maybe 2 weeks ago, and I was shocked by it. I think on some level, many of us have Zoom fatigue. We've been sitting and staring at our screens for a really long time. And I projected that onto my students' experience. I projected that onto my colleagues' experience, to my family's experience, to everyone I knew. I assumed that was the case. And yet I really didn't differentiate between positive Zoom meetings and the ability to see somebody's face where it used to be a phone call, and the annoying, boring, non-valuable time that I spent just spinning my wheels on a call. And so there was recently a survey of we'll call it Zoom fatigue as the category. And there was a distinct difference in positivity about the experience of being online with video. And that actually, if you differentiated the type of meeting and surveyed folks based on how they felt the meeting went, people felt more connected, more excited, more valued when they were heard and they felt the meeting had purpose. So in this really crazy, disconnected COVID time, there were actually huge numbers of students and teachers and educators and parents and grandparents and cousins and fill in the blank that now felt more connected than ever before. So if we take another great moment from the Chinese, isn't it the same word for crisis and opportunity? My Mandarin isn't so good, so I don't know if anybody on the call speaks Mandarin, but I think that is the case, or at least the Simpsons told me that's the case. That's my arbiter of all knowledge. And Homer pointed out crisitunity is the Mandarin word. No, but that idea that right now we're sitting in the midst of a massive shift, I look at it and I think that we've had a really interesting set of feedback loops that give us a chance now to say that we could be more connected. Imagine a participatory budgeting conversation just for a second. And this was going to be one of the stories that I wove back in. So unsuspecting, Federico, you've given me the opportunity to drop this back in. We were doing an international collaboration amongst several of my students from each of my offices for A-List education. Part of that was because at the time in 2017, I was flying from Asia to the Middle East to Tennessee to rural Mississippi, fill in the blank. I was everywhere. And what I noticed is that my students were having the same sets of conversations. It didn't matter where on the planet I was. Change the noun, maybe change the size of the conversation, but on some level, they were all wondering, how do we come together to make a group that has an impact on climate? It was showing up everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. And now I could help connect the dots between these different locations. And in this post-COVID world, you could easily see these walls have come down. We are all super comfortable having this nice, normal conversation. Even think about how different your first Zoom conversations were in the spring. If this were a professional setting, I would have the white shirt on the hanger that I'd have to put on because I had to at least pretend like I was, most people aren't even wearing pants anymore. So there's this weird moment now where our connection has been expanded. And if you could think about trying to figure out how to have an impact globally, bring that conversation together, and Zoom makes it all seem possible and comfortable and normal for everyone, I think that's something that's really special. And our social emotional health can still be improved, whether physically in the same space or not, as long as we feel heard and validated. That was the takeaway of the study. It wasn't just that you listened into somebody else talk. The highest levels of satisfaction in the Zoom conversations were when you got to share and you felt heard. And that's something that can be taught in participatory budgeting. It doesn't all have to just come back to FirstRoot. And listen, I love Luke and I love FirstRoot, but it's not the only way for us to use a lens in this conversation, but it is, to me, one that's been left out historically. We talk about group projects. We talk about coming together to do a book report. Why weren't we coming together to do a budget? Now imagine we were raising money on 5 continents to create impact locally, but to bring awareness globally. That feels really special, and that feels possible in this new time. So I really do think that COVID has changed the game, but it hasn't made it worse. I think COVID has changed the game and given us an opportunity to do something different and better.
Yeah. Thanks. Awesome.
Yeah.
Wow, that's almost the best way to end the talk right now, because it ends on the word different and better, which is inspiring. Scott, thank you so much for it was eye-opening, and for me personally, you get huge props for using the Satir change curve. Super valuable. I cracked that sucker out when I used to do consulting on agile transformations. Here's you are. This is the discontinuous event, and you're about to drop your performance, and it's going to feel crap. But here's what comes back. Happened to Tiger Woods when he retooled his swing and lost his world ranking. Happened to Tony Romo when he came out of college and he had to retrain his arm how to throw in the pros. I was like, wow, awesome stuff.
The opportunity to participate, Luke, is certainly my pleasure. I'm incredibly excited that I got an opportunity to be able to chat with you all. I don't know, is our contact information in the program guide in case anybody, maybe I'll just drop my email into the chat in case anybody would like to follow up after about anything. I will give you a generic personal email so that nobody has to think I'm trying to sell them anything. I'm not here to give pitches. By the way, if you want to buy stuff, I'm happy to sell you things. But really, if you just want to connect and have a meaningful conversation about any of this stuff, it's just my name with a dot in between at Gmail, scott.farber@gmail.
Wow. Again, thank you so much.